Good morning, Professor Elward. First and foremost, I just wanted to thank you for a great semester. I really learned a lot this semester, and I really enjoyed taking your course. I really also enjoyed getting to know you and hear about your experiences. It sounds like you've had quite a career, and I wish you all the best. So today I'm going to discuss Language Myth 13 and relate that to language files from Chapter 10. I'm also going to discuss Myth 6 and relate that to language files from Chapter 11. So to begin, I'm going to describe Language Myth 13, which is Black children are verbally deprived. And I'm going to debunk the myths and then provide support from the language file as well as an outside source. And I will do the same for Language Myth 6, which are women talk too much. So Language Myth 13 is Black children are verbally deprived, and it states that African American places value on verbal art, and though the African American culture is full of speakers who demonstrate dynamic and effective discourse, African American children are frequently described in education, literature, and in social settings as being verbally deprived, language impoverished, and other offensive names. So to debunk this myth, first off, the myth states that Black children are verbally deprived due to the idea that African American vernacular English is a flawed logic system, where speech is interpreted as inadequate when compared to Standard American English, which is otherwise known as SAE. And this is based on the logicality myth. And the logicality myth states that AAVE uses phrases and sentences that are reviewed as ungrammatical, or like rule breakers, and breaks patterns of language in comparison to sets of rules typically viewed that as superior or as the standard in American English. So that this is also viewed as language that is depriving children of their intelligence. The linguistic inferiority principle states that the speech of a socially subordinate group will always be interpreted as inadequate. So in this case, the subordinate group would be the African American vernacular English, as interpreted as inadequate by comparison to a socially dominant group, which would be the standard American English, which is typically seen. For example, African American speech is compared to the middle class in most terms, so it's also being compared to people of greater socioeconomic status, and in this way it's considered linguistically deficient or is viewed as inferior to other languages that are viewed as more standard, or are more commonly seen, or like I said, viewed of a higher socioeconomic status. So to support this myth, I used a reference that was found at the end of the chapter on page 112, and I will provide the link to this book called The Logic of Non-Standard English, Language in the Inner City, Studies in the Black English Vernacular, which is adopted from the University of Pennsylvania Press. And it's written by the author William Labov, who's a professor of linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania. And he attacks this language deprivation myth. And like I said, I will provide the reference for you from the book. And the book answers the question, does Black English exist? And Labov confirms that Black vernacular English does in fact exist through the use of stating that Black vernacular English is a well-formed set of pronunciation and grammar capable of conveying complex logic and reasoning. Therefore, it is a rule-governed language system. And he also states that it is a separate and independent dialect of English. In other words, it's a dialectal variation of language, which is still considered correct, to be correct. And according to the LF 10.4 chapter, which talks about ethnic variation in the book, it states that ethnic variation is one factor that influences language. And I thought this tied in nicely with the language myth in that AAE is an ethnic variation of language, and certain features of the language provide evidence of the West African roots that are seen in the set of language rules for African American vernacular English. So, in other words, language influences how the group speaks a standard language variety of the country or region that they live in. So, like I said, it's tied back to their Western African roots, and this is where their language rules develop and form based on this ethnic variation, or I guess dialectal variation, you could call it. So the LF 10.4 discusses some of these rules that govern the African American vernacular language, and it talks about some of the primary pronunciations and constructions that distinguish AAVE from Standard American English. And these include the predictable pronunciation changes along defined patterns, as well as unique vocabulary that is used, as well as the manner in which the tenses are used in this language. So some other morphosyntactic processes that distinguish African American Vernacular English from SAE are phonological characteristics, such as rules including word final consonant cluster reduction and vowel differences that are typically seen in African American English that are standard for their language system. It also discusses lexical differences in the language, as well as morphologic and syntactic characteristics that are defined by this dialectal variation. And these include the habitual B, which is the copula absence of the is in American English. It also describes the copula deletion, such as in the word he's. You might not see an S at the end, as well as negation, such as words like ain't that are acceptable, and third person singular inflectional suffix S. So therefore, based on the information provided from these sources, from both Labov and from the book, you can see that African American Vernacular English is a language that is representative of the African American heritage and culture. And the book states that no variety of language can be linguistically superior or inferior to any other language, and therefore it should not be seen as something that is depriving children, but rather as a dialectal variation of that language and a rule-governed language system. So moving on, I'm going to talk about myth 6, which states that women talk too much. I found this myth to be very interesting and something that I really enjoyed looking into. The language myth describes that there is a perceived idea that women talk too much and they're known for dominating conversation. However, provided in myth 6 is supporting evidence that suggests that this stereotype is inaccurate based upon the fact that language serves different functions in different contexts and is based on social confidence. But this is a common stereotype that is often associated with this myth. So to debunk the myth, I'm going to talk about the three most salient ideas or perceptions that were mentioned in the myth. So I'm going to state those three and then provide an example of some of the, common phrases that are used in society where this is typically seen. So it states that proverbs and sayings in many languages express the view that women are always talking. And an example of that would be the quote, "Women's tongues are like lamb's tails, they are never still." It also says that some suggest that while women talk, men are silent, patient listeners. And this is seen in the example, "When both husband and wife wear pants, it is not difficult to tell them apart. He is the one who is listening." And the last idea that is stated is that others indicate that women's talk is not valued, but is rather noisy, irritating prattle. And this is seen in the example, "Where there are women and geese, there's noise." So women's talk is commonly seen as irritating and not important. And so all of these ideas contribute to the myth stating that women talk too much, they're perceived as talking more than men, and they dominate conversation. And I would also argue that their conversation lacks importance. That's an also conceived notion. So in order to support this myth, I extracted my information from a SlideShare that was created by the author of the myth, Janae Holmes, and it's based on the evidence provided in the myth 6th chapter as well. So it kind of the SlideShare kind of corresponds to the evidence provided in the myth. And so it states that most of the available evidence suggests just the opposite of what the myth is saying, and instead provides information stating that women often find it hard and difficult to contribute as much as men to a discussion. So according to the language myth chapter, studies have shown that as a result, men talk most in environments where women are their conversational partners. And majorities of studies showed that men dominate conversation and ask roughly 2/3 of questions during conversation. So the majority of questions are being asked by the males. And I think this can also commonly be seen in the work environment among men and women who hold very powerful management positions. And it's common that men often patronize women and tend to dominate conversation and discussion in meetings and social interactions that involve dominant conversations to occur. So evidence shows that this pattern also starts early, especially in the classroom setting, and may be associated with power. And these reoccurring patterns show that males dominate classroom talk. So most of classroom talk is being dominated by the teacher. However, when the teacher isn't talking, it has been shown that males and boys usually dominate conversation at this time. The myth that women talk too much has become a stereotype in society and is dependent upon different factors, as I mentioned, including social context in which the talk is taking place and the relative social confidence of the speaker or their social role. So this is seen in different kinds of utterances used by men and women. And the SlideShare showed that men tend to contribute more information and opinions in conversation, whereas the kind of talk women use is more agreeing, supportive, and encouraging talk. And it also states that social confidence plays a role in when women talk. And this is most often when the conversation is inviting or associated with developing personal relationships or maintaining friendships. So Myth 6 explains that social confidence and influence impact language use. And I thought this corresponded nicely with the language file 11.3, which discusses language and power. Specifically sections discussing the role of language in power relationships and power in conversations. And it talks about the levels at which the use of language can have power. And I thought this was important to make note of, because this myth states that women talk too much, but it is important to consider the context in which women are talking in comparison to men, or in comparison to silent women. And in this case, I think the myth is basing the idea that women talk too much off of in comparison to silent women rather than men or women who talk as well. So I think that's kind of an unfair myth to state. So the myth also mentions that, or the Aleph chapter also mentions that the role of the speaker, whether dominant or subservient, depending on the individual's use of language, is seen through the utterances and the type of language that they use, which I mentioned earlier that was found in the myth. And it states that power is often associated with the male gender in their use of confidence and dominance in their language. And in certain contexts, this may signify power. This may contribute to the idea that men talk more in settings associated with higher social status and power, such as in the working world, which was mentioned earlier. And social confidence is seen in the role of language in power relationships, power in conversation, and power in society. And I think it's important to make note of, like I said, understanding the difference of the different contexts in which that language is occurring. So in certain cases, men are talking more to maybe prove a point or state their opinions or signify a powerful stance. But according to the language file 11.3, talking about pragmatic factors, it includes pragmatic factors such as whether the speaker uses more direct or indirect speech in this speech acts, which are involved in the marking of powerful relationships. So like I said, this is dependent on the type of language that people are using as well, and social confidence that is playing a role in their language. And so this may be why women converse more in social settings that appear to be inviting and where language is polite and indirect. And usually these are situations that promote cooperative communications and build rapport. And these are commonly seen in everyday life. We socialize with other people. Women, go get coffee with friends and talk about their families and reach out to family members, and are usually the ones who are seen to talk more in these environments. And these are typically environments that are seen by members of society more often, more frequently. Whereas in the business world, a lot of members in society aren't in those places and seeing that occurring as frequently. So this may be the reason for why people perceive the fact that women talk too much, to be true. Therefore, based on the information I've provided, the question, do women talk more than men, cannot be answered with a certain yes or no question. And this is based on the idea that talk serves different functions in different contexts, and once again is based upon social confidence. Thank you again for listening and for taking the time to look at my video and teach me throughout the semester. I really learned a lot and had a wonderful experience. So I hope you did as well. Have a wonderful holiday. Thanks again.